welcome all. Thanks for coming today, this afternoon to my gallery, LaiSun Keane. I am LaiSun Keane. I have with me Ngin, Cathy, Audrey An, Raina Lee, and Danyang and LaiSun. So the reason they're here is to talk about their show, Calibration. So the reason I have this show is because I wanted to put technology and art together and the conversation out there. So the more information we give to the public, the more we can understand and make our own decision. And whether you like it or not, let's discuss.
So maybe just to get started, I'll maybe just ask each of you to introduce yourself again and maybe say a little bit about your practice for a couple minutes before we get into the show and the works here.
My name is Cathy, and I've been working in ceramics for a while, and I'm recently relocated from the Bay Area to Boston, and the work I have in this show and my work in general right now is sort of mostly hand-built, mold making, and deals with like creation stories within like Asian American, Chinese American experiences of history.
Hi, I'm Audrey, and I'm doing a residency at the ceramics program, Office for the Arts at Harvard with Cathy, and my work's been about kind of notion of home, and I think I got to explore that through sampling photography data in places and recontextualizing that, or sampling aspects of like architectural facades that I've seen growing up and creating them. And recent work's been moving towards kind of recreating interior objects to kind of think about home. And for the context of this show, I made miniature versions of things that are usually made out of foam or wood and ceramics, but for this show it's just kind of 3D printed versions of them in miniature, and kind of think about idea of using digital and analog as a way to talk about bicultural upbringing.
I'm Raina Lee. I'm based in Los Angeles. I have been working in clay for about 8 years now. My other background is I'm a writer, and I work in technology and gaming. And so clay is a newer kind of thing for me, but it's, I do sculptural works, and I deal a lot with glaze and material research. That's what I'm really excited about. And I like to, in general, I like painterly applications on large pieces. So I'm interested in color and how they evoke emotion. And then a lot of the works that I make are based on Chinese history, or Greek history, or classical Greek, Chinese, Persian ceramic shapes, and kind of representing my experience on those works. And so for the 3D printed pieces I have here, I did textures where they evoke code switching from my childhood and growing up as an immigrant, as a bicultural person in California. And they have like a camo sort of print. But otherwise, yeah, I guess I'm drawn to those sort of Chinese shapes because my parents had a lot of reproductions of Chinese antiques that they bought in Taiwan. And so that was how it works for me.
Hi everyone, I'm Danyang. So I'm originally from China, and then I moved to America for my FFA. So actually I did a lot of throwing, hand building. I learned a lot of traditional Chinese ceramic technique in China. And then since I came here and I got to know 3D print, I think it's very interesting. Like how can I combine the traditional ceramic technique with the new technology together? So I started to do a lot of 3D print with hand build and throwing technique together. And then my work, most of my work is for the traditional Chinese philosophy term for Yi. It's called the unity of human and the environment or universe. And in this show, my work is mostly visualizing the invisible emotion, and also to explore how can I use the color to express the emotion and feels of emotion.
I'm really struck by the kind of density of different ways of working with ceramics as a material, and I'm an appreciator, but I don't necessarily know much about in depth about ceramic processes. So I was hoping that any of you or all of you could speak a bit more about both the kind of like specific process that you're using in these pieces, and maybe also like how you came to it. Like I know that Raina, you were mentioning earlier that you had a residency. When I think about the title of the show, Calibration, for me it suggests a kind of adaptation to a set of conditions or process of adjustment. And so I guess I'm interested, this is a question about process, but also like the process of coming through a process, if that makes sense. If you are willing to walk us through that.
So for my work, that's over there, folding screen work and little tables. So I got to start 3D printing through teaching a course at the Harvard Ceramic Studio. I didn't really do it for my own work yet. I was doing more of like the regular PLA printing and then making molds for me to sort of cast like multiples of. And so when preparing for this show, there's like an underlying layer of like, the printing process is similar, but the materiality of clay creates a bit of variables in the process where, clay would slump, it would be like not print as cute as PLA printing or something. It could not come out as accurate. And I'm like, but long story short, there was a process of discovery where, I'm kind of navigating what I was usually used to printing would be like plastic material to something that I'm like used to hand build with, but in a different way. So I had to like partition a lot of so the main subject matter for me for producing this work was recreating soban tables, which are kind of like traditional Korean tables that I've seen growing up in my grandmother's home. They're not as used anymore in like modern context, but for me, it's a subject matter that takes me to kind of that past time or having an opportunity for me to connect to like Korean heritage. So I was using that as a subject matter, but to print them, I had to like chop them up in like 4 or 5 different sections and then use just kind of analog handling of clay to assemble them. And then the folding screen part, those were just kind of, basic shapes that I would like 3D model, but the grids that you see with the triangles are just kind of the usual settings that you could see in a slicer. What I liked about that was it looked very similar to one of the typical folding screen patterns that I would see in Korea. So I was like, I thought that kind of connection was interesting, the way I can recreate that. So that's kind of how I went forward with the creation. And some of the topologies that you see on the work are kind of sample topography data of places that I have specific memories of, and typical one-part mold making process to have them be situated on top of the work. And rest of the work, I was kind of hand building elements that could be a way to create a new dialogue on top of that tablescape, I guess.
I normally hand build and throw on the wheel and do traditional ceramics, if you want to call it that, non-3D printed. And I got this residency at University of California, Santa Barbara in their media and technology department to use experimental softwares that their software engineers were making and then testing them out. So it was exciting, but I was also a test subject. And so the way that we were using Rhino was through the grad students' Grasshopper code. And so they tried to teach me Grasshopper, not really going to happen. But I did model Rhino in a really basic way. And originally I had wanted to recreate forms that I'd already done in my regular ceramics practice, which was moon jar type shapes, Maping, Greek amphora, those kind of like that'll then translate to a 3D print. So I was more interested in the process of translation and how the work changes and becomes something else once it got printed. I wasn't anticipating how all my prints would just fall apart. Like that was, and there's quite a learning curve of 3D printing, because you were saying how it slumps and you have to sort of work with the wet clay being extruded from the machine. And so then it just turned into a thing where I had to completely redesign how I was thinking of making objects. And in a way, it just seemed easier to make more vertical, extruded forms. And so then the works I have here in the back are much more vertical than other sort of curvy, bulbous shapes that I'm more used to making by hand. And yeah, in a way, for me, this whole process is about translation, where it didn't come out exactly the way I wanted, but what I found was super interesting was the textures and the unraveling of the 3D print. And it felt like it had a knitting or like a weaving quality to it, more so than like a smooth 3D printed object. And so I started looking into weaving and different kinds of weaving, and I've been trying to recreate the 3D printed works and the textures into small weavings. But it just came to this other way of like, oh, this is a different kind of coiling, which is a different kind of weaving, and then how can I have those different textures communicate to each other and those sort of craft processes. So that's how I got here, but mostly I make normal ceramics.
So I think I use 3D print. There's mainly two reasons. The first thing is like, I never learned about like 3D print in clay when I was in China. So when I first came here, I just like, I shouldn't learn about something new. I never tried it. So that's the first time I'm thinking, oh, I need to register a class like in 3D print. And later on, I think I continue to use that because actually I feel like it fits into my concept. So as I mentioned earlier, like this series of work is visualizing the invisible emotion, and a little bit about the inspiration. Actually, the inspiration is from the thyroid nodules. So because a lot of people, although we haven't realized actually all the things happen, but our body already start to react to this kind of like invisible thing, like doesn't matter emotions or pressure we got from the certain like modern society. So I think for me, this new technology like 3D printing actually is a metaphor of the society now we're living in, the new developed, like highly developed technology like nowadays. So I'm thinking about that actually is kind of a metaphor of we're like our surroundings or the time we're living in. So that's why I continue to use my like 3D print in my work. And also for the colors I use, I think is mainly it depends on, I have a kind of like a program for how to make my model day by day based on what happens in that day or based on my emotion. So I think that's why I'm exploring more color there, and I just print that, and after print that I add the little balls, the little nodules on that, and also going through the normal like glaze and like airbrush the underglaze color on that. Yeah.
I guess I'll say like out of this group, I feel like I probably use digital technologies the least. And I would say in terms of thinking about like process and ceramic process and technology, I think I first, I guess, started thinking about more when I did a residency in 2017 in San Francisco called Recology, where you actually, you work at the dump. So like all your materials are scavenged from the public dump. And because it was really nice. But you also won't find like a kiln and like a bag of clay. So it was like my first time really kind of having to think about like, oh, what do I do if I don't have clay? And then because it's San Francisco and it's such a technology city, Silicon Valley and all that, there's all these like Ethernet cables that were discarded, like all these internet cables. And I think like with digital technology, there's this perception of it's, invisible, it's in the cloud, but actually it has like a very, like very material basis, just like everything else. And so I would take those cables and coil them, and I was like, oh, this is just coiling. Like I'm coiling these cables, and even though it's not clay, it's coiling. And even though this is like a very low-tech way of building, this is like 3D printing. Like it's just coils being, coming out and like being sort of woven together, like Raina said. So that was kind of, I think, the first time I thought about it. And so for me, when I think about like these developments in technology, I'm also really amused that it's all kind of like, this is just old stuff, but like repackaged with like a different computer program, like a different thing. But, essentially, like it comes back to coiling, like this very traditional method. And then I made the peach pits in the back corner. That was made, or basically, I have a practice where I slip cast a lot of, like I'll go to different Asian supermarkets and buy a lot of different fruits and make molds and cast them. just because I was always like, these fruits are so beautiful, but like I couldn't possibly make something that's like already made and so beautiful. Like why would I bother making a peach when like this actual peach is so gorgeous? And so when I was at Kohler, they helped me scan and 3D print these like large peach pits. And then we took it through the kind of like a more, I don't know, traditional, but like took it through a process of like mold making and slip casting. And one of them is soda fired at Harvard Ceramics, which is really super fun. So it's kind of fun to like, I don't know, just thinking about these processes, like in some ways it's very elemental, like I think like kind of all has a similar origin, but also can like flatten time and space like by doing all these like different things together. So that is my non-digital perspective on using digital technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I love that point about the coil and its kind of recurrence across both ceramics. That's also a form of technology that's just a bit older, I think, than 3D printing. I mean, I guess I know that a couple of you addressed this already, but I did want to ask a question about the kind of meeting of technology and more traditional or even kind of organic forms, because when I look at the show, like it made me think about how the kind of trademark ridges of 3D printing also, like when you look at them a certain way, like look like fingerprints or look like the gills of a mushroom or a fish or something. So there's a kind of union of the technological and the biological in process, but also in form. I was wondering if any of you wanted to either talk more about the kind of metaphorical resonance of technology in your work, or maybe even about like the way that you're engaging ceramics as a technology or as a tradition.
I think growing up as a millennial, you know, there's like sense of like connection to being exposed to maybe games that kind of revolves around like world building. And I think for me, in that sense, like I'm using, you know, I can't really build a big, I don't know, what's the game? Minecraft? Or I guess I came a little before that time, but I guess like I can't really build large blocks like that for me to build this like world of my own, but I do that through this kind of the tablescape series that I've been delving into. So I guess that's like one aspect of, I guess I don't even know whether to answer the questions or answering the question. But in terms of, I think within a ceramics field, I'm noticing there's that like surge of artists who are interested in delving into printing or clay printing or usage of digital technology in different aspects. And what I've been loving about my time in Boston is that there are like me starting clay, I wasn't really, wheel throwing wasn't my gig, like I sucked at it and so on, but I had a graphic design background, so I already knew how to use computer or pretty tech savvy, but I did want to pursue clay, and finding this like a middle ground where I can have a space was wonderful. And even teaching at the Harvard studio, there's so many like software engineers or designers who find their creative pursuit through this way of making that I found really exciting in terms of having creative inclusivity, I guess. That's maybe something that I want to point out.
I think I can continue a little bit, like just follow what Audrey said. I think like the technology like of 3D print actually it provides someone who don't know how to hand build or don't have any ceramic experience, this kind of people, or someone they know how to use Rhino or they already have a model but they don't know anything about ceramics. It's provide a kind of a gate for this group of people to start to experiment with ceramic. Maybe through this process they found, oh, I really love ceramics. Maybe they will start to learn more techniques like hand building mold, like casting and everything. So that's why I think that's a good thing for people to know about ceramic, this material. And for the form, like organic list form, like that question, I think for my work only, I think because my inspiration from the nodules is from the cell, is from the kind of like body, human body. So that's why I think my form might like be more organic
I think I remember the question, but I'm gonna go off what these two have said. Yeah, I guess I got to this particular kind of technology. I mean, I'm a writer and I worked in gaming and advertising for a long time, and writing is very abstract, so you don't really get a product at the end. You might work on a campaign or you finish a book, but you know, after working in those industries for years, it was exciting to pick up clay because you're making tangible objects, and so I did that for some years, and somehow I got attracted to 3D printing. I'm like, oh, I'm interested in the abstract again and digital representations of existence. And you know, years ago I published a zine called One Up, and it was feminist critiques on gaming culture. And so it was like I would write about gaming culture and what was happening in the culture, sort of like that movie Trekkies that talked about Star Trek culture, but I would write about people in gaming, like people who dressed in cosplay, people who would write personal experiences about writing, you know, playing Tetris, that sort of thing. And so I was largely interested in people in gaming worlds, but how they brought the gaming experience to their real lives. And so I was attracted to the 3D printing because, you know, it was kind of like Audrey, who was like, oh, I grew up with these games, I'm interested in world building, but I can't create, like, you know, a giant world. And so for me, I'm like, oh, this is an interesting way I can create objects in a digital form. I'm not great at Rhino, but I, you know, can do Photoshop, so I was able to learn very basics in Rhino. So my approach to the residency I did at UC Santa Barbara was I started scanning objects and then creating 3D models. It would spit out a model based on that, and then I could convert that into G-code or do whatever in Grasshopper with different textures. And so I found it more interesting to start scanning things I'd already made in clay and then printing them, or scanning objects or scanning people, and then just to see how that translated. And so I just became really obsessed with like recreating the objects in the world, because what I saw in the 3D printing universe of clay was so many mathematical models. Like, I don't know if it was like the people who do 3D printing, they like math models. It was just maybe like a certain kind of like guide that did that. I don't know. Anyways, I don't want to point any fingers, but like that was how I felt about a lot of the 3D printing that I could see. And so I was like, well, I want to work with objects that have meaning to me in the world. And so I started scanning things, and it was also faster than me trying to make something in Rhino. Like, yeah, exactly. So that's kind of how I got here, is like I was interested in, you know, kind of like a gaming world representation of existence just from my previous experience as a writer, but also working in clay, working in this objects, and somehow I found myself in front of the computer again. So
I guess I was just going to say, thinking about, I guess, just literally the ridges you were talking about, like that 3D printing will leave. It was funny because the only thing I've really 3D printed are those, and I had a lot of assistants doing this, like printing those peach pits. And I just remember I was like obsessed with getting rid of the ridges. I was like, I do not want this in any way to look like it was 3D printed. It came from like a 3D printed model. So I just spent like, I remember I spent like 3 or 4 days just like sanding, just like hand sanding and like getting carpal tunnel. And I remember the Kohler guys, you know, because they like sand toilets all day too, and those have to be perfectly smooth. So they're like, yeah, you got to sand more, you got to sand more. No, but then it was funny because then all these, we would have a lot of visiting artists come through too, and they're just like, let the clay be, like just let it be, like you printed it, so like let it be printed. So I don't know, just because I guess I haven't had that much experience with like thinking about those things. But yeah, it was interesting, like my, you know, because I think like very purposefully, like the 3D printed objects are like 3D printed, like you know it's 3D printed. And then maybe just because I haven't spent as much time with it or just am newer to it, I was just like a lot more obsessed with making it look like that wasn't the origin. And yeah, I don't know, it's something I still think about, just like those two different reactions, like just let it be, or just like no. Like no, don't, I don't know, yeah.
It's funny because I feel like 3D printing was so difficult for me to get into, and then we used Potterbot, which was like so difficult to use, that every time I printed something, there was no way I was going to do that. Like, everyone's going to see how many hours I spent learning with the tube, with like the extruder, and carrying this 20-pound tube.
After that, cleaning the machine, right?
So I was like, okay.
You're like, it's gonna show.
You're gonna see it. And sometimes it collapses, so you print for, you hold it, you spin on the printer, and everything flat. You have nothing that day.
Just my peers.
Yeah. I just can't do this. So that's why I really want to leave the mark, let people know that is very Raina.
So, like, I am currently teaching a summer course titled Digital Clay, where people are like learning how to model and either outputting it for plastic printing, for mold making purposes, for slip casting, or direct clay printing. And I think there was a sense of, I think when I first got into clay printing, I was like, I felt so precious about this newly born, very malleable print. And I was like, and then but I didn't like the extrusion line for me so I was like, oh, maybe it's not a process that I might want to engage with my own personal work. And then I noticed like students who are in the class, I got to learn to be just treated as the same as what I would be slip casting. It's just another way to create multiples. And you can either just go over it with a sponge or glaze thick enough that the extrusion lines would disappear. And I guess just from that interaction within the class made me realize like, oh, okay, it's just however the artists take away that. So for mine, I was like, I don't like the extrusion line. I'm just gonna make it like fuzzy mode kind of situation that it creates like almost like a textural surface, though it hinders the extrusion line. So that's like the route that I ended up taking. And then I would also maybe do the sanding too. So it's like, I guess it depends on what you want to do with this like ways of making that suits your practice kind of situation.
Okay, I think I'll ask maybe one more question and open it up to the audience. That sounds good. I mean, some of these ideas coming up around translation and transmission like make me think about how a couple of you spoke about being an immigrant or being a children of immigrants, some of the kind of culturally specific references and histories that are present in the work. So I was curious if anyone who wants to could speak to how the work that's present in this show or the kind of processes you've been talking about, if and what they have to do with ideas of diaspora or ideas of being Asian American, say.
So for me, I guess a lot of my work right now has been thinking about creation stories. And like in 2020-ish, I got really obsessed with this Chinese mythology about this goddess named Niwa. And she is the creator of people, basically. So the story is like, she has like the body of a snake and arms ahead of a human. And she was lonely, so she just started sculpting she grabbed some earth and started sculpting with it, and made little people in her image. And so for me, when I read that story, I like kind of realized like, oh my God, like the creator is a ceramicist. Like, like I was like, oh shit. Like, God is a ceramicist, and oh my God, I'm a ceramicist, and a lot of my friends are ceramicists, and oh my God, no, but like, joking aside, it was like actually really, I think, kind of this like really empowering idea of being a maker and like kind of creating the world in your own vision, and you can create the world that you want. So I started like directly making like the sculpture on the table is hand built, but those are supposed to be her hands sculpting. So like it is for me like thinking about that mythology and sort of like applying it to like sort of my experience, like contemporary experiences of just this idea of like, oh, we as people have agency and we can like make the world the way we want it to be. Like this idea of resilience. So that's kind of like, I think for me, like where my process and the concepts behind the process really started to line up.
I guess I want to respond to the aspects of like mistranslation. I speak Korean. I grew up speaking Korean and I kind of learned English. I was born here, but then I started learning English in like second grade. So I always felt, like growing up, I felt very kind of, oh, I don't sound that like American enough or something like that. And that was something that I had to like deal with growing up. And navigating that realm, or even like this kind of since I grew up moving back and forth Korea and US pretty often, like there's that like cultural oscillation that kind of also deals with kind of emotional oscillation. And once I started working with clay, I also knew that I wanted to do something digital at the same time. And I think this way of navigating both kind of, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, whenever I speak Korean and English, there's like a moment where, oh, I could have like explained it better in Korean, or there are certain ways that I'm like talking about things that just doesn't get translated the same, it doesn't hold the same meaning or something. And as I'm growing up, I started to learn to just embrace that and just be more fluid about that. And within clay, like, you know, there's aspects that clay can do materially that is advantageous that maybe wood can't do, and wood can do something amazing that clay can't do. And I'm starting to learn how to kind of navigate the two and just embrace that maybe mistranslation between the material, or so I guess that there's that part. And another thing that I'm trying to say is like, whenever I'm trying to execute what I'm seeing digitally into like a physical form, there's certain glitch that would happen between the processes. And I think, I don't know, I guess I'm like trying to use all that metaphors and use that as a way for me to engage coming back to the studio, because I kind of find it fun noticing that moments, how these materials would behave, going back and forth, analog and digital. And I find kind of kinship because I feel like it's relatable for my personal experience as well.
Yeah, I guess I make work based on classical Chinese shapes because that's kind of the work that I saw around me in my house. But I don't know if I would necessarily, it's any particular Asian American identity sort of statement. I grew up going to museums. In college I worked at the Smithsonian. You know, I was around a lot of museum objects, and I feel like when you learn ceramics, you learn the classical forms of ceramics, the wheel throwing, the Greek pottery, the Etruscan, the Chinese Song Dynasty stuff. And so I think I just started making those forms because that's how you learn basic ceramics. Like that's what they show you in class. And for me, making these sort of classical forms in my own particular way with either the 3D printed textures or the sort of like textured glazes that I like to make, that's how I've translated that experience of these sort of archetypical objects in the museum and relating them to museum objects that my parents had like replicas of, because you know you grew up in a Chinese house and there's all this like wood carving furniture and lamps that look like Song Dynasty vases, but they're replicas from Chinatown. And it's just my version of a replica of an antique, of something that was in a museum, of the canon. And so that's how I'm using translation and tradition and just sort of my own way of expressing that experience. You know, I always think that like it's funny that we're all Asian American here. It's not something I would have expected for the 3D printed work. And I was thinking like, oh, are we really futuristic? Are we like Afrofuturism, but like Asian? Like, and I always want a version of that, like some kind of Afrofuturism, but Asian Americans. You know, because then we can create our own futures in a totally different technological way. And so that's kind of my perspective of the work that I do. It's like, I want to create a kind of science fiction future where I wrote my character and like my experience into it.
I think for my work, it also kind of the same. Like I'm not intentionally talking about like I want the audience to know I'm from Asia, but it's kind of, although I explore the Chinese traditional philosophy, the unity of human and universe. I mean, we talk about like how people finding a balance like in their spiritual world, but I feel like also in other culture, Western culture, we talk about meditation, we talk about spiritual alchemy. So actually, we are kind of like talking the same thing, but maybe my perspective is more from Chinese traditional philosophy. So I kind of want my work to be kind of like an open-ended film, so everyone can have like different feelings, or they relate it to their own experience in their own way. But I would like to, if someone comes to me and asks me about the topic I explored, behind my work, I will be so happy to talk about my own culture, like Asian culture, Chinese culture. But if they have their own understanding of my work, even if it's not related to Chinese culture, Asian culture, I'm also fine with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing, thinking more about, I guess, translation, because a lot of my work also, besides the peach pits, does involve just working with a lot of fruit, like slip casting a lot of different fruits. And I grew up in Miami, Florida, where there's like just a big immigrant community, and also very tropical with like lots of different like fruits like mamey and coconuts and passion fruit and stuff like that. And so for me, I just also think it's like interesting to think about how a lot of fruits that we think of as being like very American or like very, you know, ubiquitous in American culture, like bananas, you know, peaches are like the state fruit of Georgia and things like that. Like they're actually all like foreign or were foreign at one point, right? So like some fruits, you know, assimilate in a way into like mainstream culture in the US, but in actuality it's like all of the origins are from, you know, different places, and, you know, it's kind of like increasingly so. So like it is really interesting because I do also feel like a lot of my things do kind of reference like my heritage of like my parents being Chinese or Taiwanese, but also recognizing too that like, especially having been born and raised in the US, like this idea of like an authentic culture or like something that's very like separated, like this is American, this is Asian, and like even that is like so loaded, those labels too. And so yeah, I think a lot of my work is sort of like grappling with that sense of like trying to be specific, but also recognizing that you know, things don't just have like one origin or single origin. It's like really a mix of cultures that create every culture. And so yeah, it's just a big mess.